Hi everyone, and welcome to the next chapter from Nimzowicz's My System. This time we'll look at the second chapter from part 2, which is entitled Doubled Pawns and Restraint. These factors, doubled pawns and restraint, have a close relationship to each other. Restraint in chess can of course take place without the presence of doubled pawns, but real total restraint that covers entire stretches of the board and gives the restrained player positional breathing difficulties is only possible when doubled pawns have been inflicted upon them. The first issue to examine is to what extent this suffering extends. The fact that isolated double pawns are an endgame weakness and very tough to defend doesn't quite sum up the difficulties per se, as much as this suffering still exists when the doubled pawns are not isolated. There's also the problem of the difficulties in creating a passed pawn when we have a pawn majority that includes doubled pawns, for example a2, b2, c3, as we see here, against a7, b7 and c7. So that's another problem with doubled pawns. But the main cause of suffering is that an advance in close formation, there's a tendency towards paralysis. For example, if we take a look at the position on the board before us here, if white had a pawn on b2 instead of c2, he could continue with d4, d5, and then c3, c4, c3, c4, and then b4, and then c5. However, with the pawns as they stand here, any attempt to transfer the attack from e5 to d6 in such a way, we can see the chapter from the elements on pawn chains if you want to see that in more detail, but such an attack here will fail. For example, if d4, for example king f8, d5, king g8, and c4 with the idea of playing c5, black plays simply b6, and it's impossible for white to make any further progress. And this is the principal weakness of compact doubled pawns, and recognizing that allows us to create this rule. When your opponent possesses a pawn mass weakened in attacking scope through doubled pawns, it's worthwhile to push him into advancing it. Therefore, in our initial position here, black must provoke his opponent into continuing with action in the center. As long as he's permitted to keep his pawn on d4, at this stage the disadvantage of the doubled pawn is not evident. It only makes itself known when he advances in the center. And in this case, white's doubled pawns constitute an active weakness because it's doing something. He's able to use it to advance here, but they can also constitute a passive weakness. For example, if we add rooks to the initial position, here the pawns become a static weakness, and their weakness becomes apparent when you attack them. The pawns here on c2 and c3. In such cases, you shouldn't be afraid to undouble your opponent's pawns. Black can play c6 here, and if d takes c6, rook takes c6, and he's attacking down here very nicely. Whereas if c4, c takes d5, c takes d5, undoubling the pawns in order to play rook c3 and then rook a3 with an advantage in both lines. The rule in these cases goes as follows. When the doubled pawns show a static weakness, then you should advance against them and not at all be afraid to undouble the pawns, as the weak structure will remain and one disadvantage disappears so that another may emerge. Okay, so we'll go on to the next example now. This position is taken from one of Nimzowicz's own games, and he had black here against a man called Con. So Nimzowitsch with black encourages Con's hope that he is playing for a simplification, implying that the exploitation of the doubled pawns in the endgame should not be all that hard, here playing Queen d7. So, play continued, Queen e1, Knight g6, Bishop d3, Bishop f6, Queen f2, Bishop e5. Black is counting on the strength of this outpost square as a strategy. So, Rook c2, Rook f8, King h1, b6, Queen f3. We won't go into too much detail here, we'll just get to the position that is relevant to what we're talking about. So, now came f6, and at this point Con allows himself to be tempted into an attack that ultimately results in the opening of the game and exposing the pawns on e3 and e4. He plays c5 to vacate the c4 square, so that after bishop takes f4, rook takes f4, d takes c5, bishop c4 check can be played. But after knight f7, g5, rook e5, rook f5, takes. In Nimzowicz's view, black can force a win with king h8. And after g6 comes knight h6, and if instead of g6, bishop takes f7, queen takes f7, g6, queen d5 check, and h6 next, and a very promising endgame, a pawn up and with a weak pawn on e3 to attack. So from this example it should be clear that black was correct in his waiting strategy. White's flank attack had to fail due to black's powerful center in the e5 square. It's far more often the case that waiting moves are effective when our opponent has doubled pawns. However, it should be noted that black could have chosen to advance also, because the e3 and e4 pawns were a passive weakness. So if we return to the beginning of this line, Queen d7 is the first move that black plays, but he could play, instead of Queen d7, Knight d7, attacking e4. So bishop f3, and now knight f6, Queen c2 again to defend e4, and now black can try c6, giving up the d pawn positionally so that he can get the e4 pawn in return. For example, rook cd1, queen e7. White can't further defend the e pawn, but he'll win d6 in return. For example, g3, knight takes e4, bishop takes e4, queen takes c4, queen takes, rook takes d6, and rook takes e3. So the principal rule in such positions is isolated doubled pawns and compact or advancing doubled pawns should not be challenged, i.e. attacked by other pawns. An opposing doubled pawn complex that has not yet advanced should, on the other hand, be provoked into action before being challenged. In a sense, they could thus be seen to tire themselves out a little through advancing and weakening themselves as a result. So, returning back to this position we saw a moment ago, we'll now look at the only true strength of doubled pawns, at least in Nimzowicz's view. As we saw already, the white pawns here possess a certain latent weakness due to the doubled pawn they contain. This weakness is most likely to show itself when the pawns try or are forced to advance. Nimzowitsch called this a dynamic weakness. However, when the pawn mass remains still, it can be quite strong. For example, at this moment white can play d4, and from here it takes a lot of effort if black wants to force white into playing either d takes e5 or pushing the pawn to d5. In fact, this would be easier if he had a pawn on b2 instead of c2. As a result, doubled pawns such as these make it easier to hold out, if that is what's required. Also, there's the open file, which may well be relevant if heavy pieces remain on the board, the B file here. It will of course open direct lines to the opponent's king, if it's castle queenside in this instance, or if the open file is in front of the king. And you know, if achieved, a position such as the one we see on the board here should be held onto for as long as possible with white. If the d5 push is played, then the weakness of the doubled pawns will soon be felt. Therefore, the opposing player should try and force this to happen, but not through playing c5 or something like that, because then white can happily answer d5 and there's no way for black to challenge the d5 pawn. Moreover, he could have used the c5 square for his pieces. Black could have, after d5 is played by white, and he will lose that opportunity too if he plays c5 with a pawn. So, in such positions as this, many players with the black pieces make the error of playing d5, trying to attack their opponent, instead of aiming to provoke them, which is the correct strategy, as we've seen. So let's look at some examples from actual gameplay. This was played between Hawkinson with white and Nimzowitsch in 1921. Hawkinson opened with d4, then came knight f6, c4, e6, now knight f3, sidestepping the Nimzo Indian. So we saw b6 going into a Queen's Indian instead. Bishop g5, h6, bishop f6, queen f6, e4, bishop b7, knight c3, bishop b4, queen d3, bishop takes, b takes, d6. And now, after a later e5 push from black, we will have the pawn structure in question. Play continued, queen e3, knight d7, bishop d3, e5, castles, castles, a4, a5, and knight e1. So white has a good position, as it's unlikely that black can force him into playing d5, which is what black wants. However, this knight e1 creates some internal problems. Correct instead, Nimzowitsch felt, was knight d2 and then f3, giving the white queen the f2 square if needs be, because it's a little exposed where it is. So how to refute knight e1? If you want to try and figure out how, then stop the video now. Rook a e8 was the move, with the idea that after f3, queen e6, black should play d5. As it turned out, Hawkinson played knight c2 instead. And now we can see the point of Nimzowicz's play. E takes d4, e takes d4, and now f5, exploiting this pin. So d5, queen e5, queen d4, knight c5, rook fd1, and f takes e4, winning a pawn. F takes e4, knight takes d3, rook takes d3, queen takes e4. And black went on to wins. Instructive play from Nimzowitsch, very clear and concrete chess. So we can see the same struggle in more serious action against a much stronger opponent in the next example. This time Nimzowitsch had black against Janowski. The game was played at the St. Petersburg tournament of 1914. Janowski opened with d4, then came knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, bishop b4, the Nimzo Indian, e3, b6, bishop d3, bishop b7, knight f3, bishop takes, b takes, d6, queen c2, knight bd7, e4, e5, castles, castles, bishop g5, h6, bishop d2, rook e8, rook a e1. And now black again has the task of provoking his opponent into playing the d5 push, or taking some kind of action in the center. Nimzowitsch attempted exactly that with the maneuver knight h7, planning to bring the knight to e6 via f8. So h3, knight h, f8, knight h2, knight d6, bishop e3 to defend d4, and now c5, because there was no way to put further pressure on the pawn. So only now does white play d5, and now comes knight f4, bishop e2, and now knight f8, and black's thinking is that, you know, the knight on f4 here is a strong piece, and the weakness of white's c4 pawn allows him to set up play on both wings. It's very hard to provoke white out of this crouching position if he's not willing to do so voluntarily through trying to create initiative. That's something that always has to be kept in mind. You know, it's very difficult to force this kind of play, but it should still be the aim. So as a result of that, we should only inflict double pawns if we feel it will be possible to force our opponent into action, which isn't always the case. But if we're playing with the black pieces, then, you know, we're happy to play to neutralize our opponent generally. Okay, so in this game, Nimzowitsch had white against Rosselli del Turco, played in Baden-Baden in 1925. He opened with knight f3, and after d5, b3, c5, e3, knight c6, bishop b2, bishop g4, h3, bishop takes, queen takes, e5, bishop b5. It's the same kind of ideas going on, except with colors reversed, obviously. Queen d6, and here he has the opportunity to double his opponent's pawn because of the pressure on e5. He can take on c6 and the queen can't take, or e5 falls. However, white has to ask himself, what does he gain through doing this? Can he force black into playing d4 afterwards? And the answer is no. Therefore he played instead e4, and after d4 he first threw in knight a3, threatening knight c4 and the doubling of the pawns, again because of the pressure. So he provoked f6 and knight c4, queen d7. The point of f6, amongst other things, is to clear the defense of e5, so the queen isn't tied to it. That's why knight c4 threatened to double the pawns. So now queen h5 check. This prevents black from castling queenside as opposed to kingside, because after g6 comes queen f3 with pressure on f6. So queen c7. If instead castles, then knight a5 is troublesome, because g6 has been provoked. So knight g e7 isn't possible because f6 would drop. So this is the point of the queen check before. So queen c7, and now queen g4. And this powerful g4 to d7 diagonal will mean that white has to suffer doubled pawns in order to avoid more unpleasant stuff. Sorry, black has to suffer double pawns. The player who's aiming to retain the crouching position with his central pawns has greatly reduced piece mobility, which on its own is often enough to provoke the desired pawn push. So king f7 was played here because queen e6 check was threatened, and then bishop takes c6, doubling the pawns. And this would create a bad weakness for black to have to defend. And creating the doubled pawns is the whole focus of white's play here. It's important to bear that in mind. So f4, h5, queen f3, e takes f4, now bishop takes c6. It's now the correct moment because the queen can't recapture, or f4 the queen takes f4. So b takes c6. If queen takes c6 and queen takes f4, it leads immediately to a strong attack. For example, rook e8 castles, queen takes e4. If instead rook takes e4, knight e5 check, wins at least the exchange. So queen takes e4, now queen c7 check. This is winning. After queen e7, knight d6 check. And after king g7, knight takes e8, again winning the exchange. So b takes c6. Now simply castles. And g5. Black's going to stay a pawn ahead, but white has achieved his goal, so it's irrelevant. The point is that the black position can be opened up by playing 3 pawn moves: c3, e5, and h4. 2 of these moves will not suffice. It must be all 3, as we'll see. So Nimzowitsch has judged this position very well, and he manages to play all 3 pawn pushes. First with c3, rook d8, now rook ae1 to support the e5 push, knight d7, e5, knight f5, now c takes d4, which is surprising because it allows knight takes d4. If instead c takes d4 and e takes f6, king takes f6, queen e4 is strong for white. So knight takes d4, queen e4, bishop e7, and not f5 or queen b1. Keeps the pressure on f5 and thereby threatens bishop takes d4 and queen takes f5. So king e6, now queen d3, and knight d6 is coming next, and white gets a great attack. So bishop e7 and now h4, undermining f4 as well as g5, and suddenly black's position collapses like a house of cards. So queen d7, ef6, bishop takes f6, hg5, and black resigned. He can't take the pawn, or knight e5 check is winning the queen, and if bishop g7, knight e5 again forces the bishop off, and the black king is absolutely helpless, and white wins quickly with a direct attack. So as a result, we can see there the restraint of the doubled pawn complex led to a crushing attack. Okay, this next game was played between Nimzowitsch with white and Sämisch at Dresden in 1926. Nimzowitsch included it to show how the player who is hanging on with his doubled pawns has to deal with the fact that his pawn complex has very limited mobility and his pieces will suffer as a result. Their moves will have to be small and precise, directed at both sides of the board. Nimzowitsch opened with c4, then came e5, knight c3, knight f6, knight f3, knight c6, e4, bishop b4, d3, d6, g3, bishop g4, bishop e2. It's kind of unorthodox after having played g3, but it's meeting the needs of the position. h6, bishop e3, bishop takes c3, b takes c3, queen d7. So white now has the doubled pawns, and Nimzowitsch was of course fully aware of their dynamic weakness and therefore wanted to keep the pawn mass as they are, specifically with the d pawn on d3, or at worst d4. The moves that follow fit in with this strategy, and indeed, when mobility is restricted, it's essential to be economical. So next came queen c2. If instead, for example, queen d2, castle's long, and the queen is very clumsily placed on d2, interfering with the harmony of the other pieces. So queen c2 is better. So castles. If black tries castling long, then after queen c2 he can get into hardship. For example, the castles long, and then rook f b1 next, and the pieces are starting to work together well. So castles, and now queen d2 is a good move because it creates strong pressure on the king side where the black king is castled. So knight h7, h3, this is a pawn sack to open lines, which Sämisch amazingly enough accepted. Bishop takes h3 here. So knight g1, bishop g4, f3, bishop e6, and now d4, and Sämisch presumably had been counting on bishop takes h6 here, which looks strong, but there was a trap hidden beneath the position that is now revealed. Black is going to lose a piece here because there's a threat of d5, but even if he moves the knight, the bishop has no squares, so it's forcibly winning a piece at this stage. So, you know, obviously white would not have wanted to advance the pawn in such a manner, in particular due to the weakening of the c4 and c5 squares, and, you know, the weakness of his doubled pawn would then be very clear. However, when he's getting a piece for it, then it's worth it, and white went on to win from here, with Sämisch resigning after another 15 moves. So we've had a good analysis of the doubled pawn complex, and the resultant understanding should allow us to look at everyday events over the chessboard with a new perspective. This game was played between Spielmann and Rubinstein at Karlsbad in 1911. Spielmann opened with e4, then came e5, knight f3, knight c6, knight c3, knight f6, bishop b5, bishop b4, castles, castles, d3, d6, bishop g5, bishop takes c3, b takes c3, queen e7, rook e1, knight d8, and d4. The prevailing wisdom at the time this game was played maintained that white had the attacking position in the center at this moment. However, Nimzowitsch felt that this was wrong, and that it would only be true if white had a pawn on b2 instead of c2. In Nimzowicz's view, the only purpose to the d4 pawn is to mask the weak pawns on c2 and c3. If white ever plays d5, then the weakness becomes obvious, as we've seen. Such a setup can be seen as a kind of crouching position, like a frog, in Nimzowicz's view, hardly a fearsome attacking animal. Play continued knight e6, bishop c1, and now c6. Nimzowitsch felt that c5 was more correct, forcing white to make a decision. D takes c5, d takes c5, knight takes e5 doesn't work because of knight c7, attacking two pieces at once. So c6, now bishop f1, rook d8, g3, queen c7, knight h4. White has the idea of playing f4 to increase pressure on e5. After the sequence followed to reach this point, we have to ask ourselves whether or not white has had the initiative in the center, and the answer can only be no. It's only because black plays c6 instead of c5 that white has been able to build up an attack from his crouching position. Play continued d5, f4, e takes, and then e5, knight e4, g takes f4, f5, ef6, knight f6, f5, knight f8, queen f3, and Spielmann went on to win convincingly. So we can play through the moves quickly just for the sake of curiosity. Queen f7, bishop d3, bishop d7, bishop f4, rook e8, bishop e5, c5, king h1, c4, bishop e2, bishop c6, queen f4, knight 8 d7, and so on. Now, a very nice shot, knight g6 check, and white is crashing through here. H takes g6, the point is after queen h8 check, knight g8, bishop d6. And Spielmann is just tying Rubinstein in knots here. The latter is pinned and restrained on all fronts, making it impossible to prevent a penetration on the g-file. Queen d8, rook g6, knight df6, rook f6, rook f6, rook g7, and Rubinstein resigns. So it's a crushing attack, to be sure, but one that Spielmann should not have had, because Rubinstein could have played c5 instead of c6. Okay, so now we can move on to the examination of the next double pawn complexes, which will be the one that we see before us here. Black has doubled c pawns and an open b file, as well as this one here. Black has doubled f pawns and an open g file. In both cases, it's clear that black has a substitute for the center that he has lost, because doubled pawns on both c6 and f6 extend in the direction of the center. For example, with this pawn structure, white is unable to make sure of the outpost square e5. There's also the threat that black can play e6 to e5 at any moment, i.e. his doubled pawns have a certain fluidity, and he has other ideas such as playing f5, placing a rook on g8, and then advancing his h-pawn to h4, after which white is coerced into playing g3. Sorry, once white has been coerced into playing g3, and following up with f4 to create immense pressure on the king side, especially if the king's there, of course. In short, the three pawns here, f7, f6, and e6, can open up dangerously, in Nimzowicz's words, like a fist, and be sent to attack. The weakness here is, of course, the h7 pawn. White will aim to prevent the aforementioned attack by playing g3 and f4, as well as probably knight f3 and bishop g2. And Nimzowitsch gives such a setup from both sides an approximately equal chance. However, he emphasizes that it's extremely difficult for black to judge the correct moment to advance his otherwise sound defensive pawns on the E and F files. So we'll end this section here, and we'll begin the next section by looking at those examples. Okay.